want to welcome everybody to this webinar today. My name is Ara Topouzian. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Venture Capital Association. And if you've been following our webinar series, we've been doing these on a weekly basis. Started when we all sort of went into self-isolation and found that there was definitely a need to provide some relevant information, not only to MVCA members, but really the entire investment and innovation community here in Michigan. And so we've been bringing to you some different subjects with a wide variety of guests and panelists. And today, I've got the pleasure of having Bobby Franklin with us. Bobby is the President CEO of the National Venture Capital Association. And real quick, just to give you a little bit of background on Bobby, the NVCA is based in Washington, D.C. They've also got offices out in Palo Alto and San Francisco, California. NVCA acts as the voice of the U.S. venture capital and startup community by advocating for public policy that supports the American entrepreneurial ecosystem. Powered by its members, NVCA arms the venture community for success, serving as the leading resource for venture capital data, practical education, peer-led initiatives, and networking. Prior to joining NVCA in 2013, Bobby spent 10 years at CTIA, a large Washington, D.C. based trade association representing the entire wireless industry. While there, he served as the executive vice president and second in command to the CEO. Before CTIA, Bobby also served as vice president, federal government affairs, and head of Alto's Washington, D.C. office. In that capacity, Bobby was responsible for the company's legislative and regulatory advocacy in Washington. Professional career with nearly 8 years of experience at Capitol Hill, which is right behind him there in his screenshot there. He has a BA in finance and banking from the University of Arkansas, and he's with his wife and 3 teenagers. They reside in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm assuming, Bobby, you're with all of them at the moment, and they're with you. And how are you doing? I guess, well, first, let me just say thank you for being part of this. Really, first time you and I have been able to kind of get together and chat a little bit, but how are you doing throughout this current situation?
Well, thanks for having me, Ara. It's great to be with you and folks in Michigan. We're doing fine. Knock on wood, everybody's safe and healthy in our household. I've got restless teenagers, a freshman in college and 2 in high school. So their distance learning and all that is getting old to them, and they're ready to get out with their friends like everyone else. But we're fine and we're safe and healthy, and that's all you can ask these times.
Yeah, that's what counts the most. So, Bobby, we're going to talk about a variety of issues today. Certainly, we'll cover issues pertaining to COVID-19, but I think we want to really just lead with sort of the VC activity for last year. We put out, as you know, a yearly research report to talk about the strength of the ecosystem. We just released that at the beginning of April, and NVCA also does constant monitoring of venture activity throughout the country. And I think we both know that 2019 was a great year for investments. In particular, you folks noted that Grand Rapids, Michigan, was a hotbed for venture growth last year. And so I'm wondering what you felt were the factors that led to that growth.
Well, it's a great question, and it's one that we get all the time from folks around the country. Mostly, how can we have more venture activity? And when you look at Michigan, to me, a lot of things stand out. First of all, you have a great ecosystem, a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem. I mean, entrepreneurs, we always say, are located everywhere, but you really have to have kind of this ecosystem to support them. You need great universities, and I think you all have, what, 9 outstanding research universities, and you're in the top 5 of research dollars, and that can be sort of the basis and an anchor uh, to marry up with entrepreneurs and to make sure that you have angel capital available and venture capital. And there's a bunch of venture capitalists in the state of Michigan, and you're investing in tons of companies. And, that rich ecosystem are the things that we look at. And then you see it in our data. And so each quarter we release a venture monitor, like you release your report. And you mentioned that we keep tabs on what's happening in the country. In partnership with PitchBook, we look at what's happening everywhere. And as you pointed out, we recognize Grand Rapids and some of the growth that's happened there. We try to make sure that we're looking beyond the epicenters of the San Francisco Bay Area, New York, and Boston, to find out what's happening and to try to measure and really enhance what's happening everywhere else. I mean, if it were up to us, it would be far more evenly spread out throughout the country.
Right.
And we do a lot to try to help make that happen.
To that point, how important is Michigan to, let's say, the national landscape?
I think
It's
it's
grown certainly over the last few years, and as we talk about, we're not really considered that flyover state. I think maybe that we once were, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when we think about the prominent areas of activity outside of the 3 epicenters, Michigan's always on that list. I mean, you look at Austin, Texas, but when you look at the Midwest, you sort of have to recognize that of all the states around the Great Lakes region, Michigan has tons of activity, and it's so important. It's important for a number of reasons. It's important to help establish capital formation off the coast. And certainly, as we know, the earlier the investment that happens in the life of a company, usually the closer in geography it's necessary to be its investors and the entrepreneur. And so you need that early stage capital in places other than the coast if we're going to see the level of innovation and economic prosperity in other parts of the country that are desperately needed. So when you think about the list of states, I mean, Michigan's always up there. And as I'm sure all of the folks watching in Michigan know, we're fortunate at NVCA to have Jan Garfinkel as our board chair right now from Ann Arbor and Arboretum Ventures. So not only are you kind of recognized for the activity in the state, but you have folks there that are recognized nationally.
Talk a little bit about the national exposure. Just in last year, can you maybe speak to some great national investments that sort of stick out in your mind?
Well, venture is so widespread and there's so many different sectors of the economy. It's really difficult for us at NVCA to keep track of all of them. But I know that when we think about some interesting investments and you look at what's happening in Michigan and you think about the breadth and the variety, and I know there was a company that's helping launch satellites that I can't think came out of Michigan. Was it Michigan State or another place? Michigan Tech, sorry. And then obviously with our relationship with Arboretum Ventures and knowing what's happening in the life science space, and there are companies there that are working on testing and things that help with COVID-19. I mean, you have a wide variety of excellent examples. To look at kind of how we see the whole country, instead of me trying to remember things off the top of my head, I would just point, we have a great resource in this Venture Monitor that comes out once a quarter. And it's always on our website, and folks can go to nvca.org and search for Venture Monitor, and you'll see tons of information about what's happening across the country.
Great. Thanks, Bob. So we got to talk about COVID-19. I don't think there's a conversation happening right now that doesn't include that. But, first off, this is really not the first time VCs have experienced a crisis, right? But this one seems to be fairly unique. How does this differ from past crises as far as it relates to the venture community?
I mean, this feels like, once in 100 years, right? I mean, this feels like it feels very different than either the 2000 internet bubble or even the 2008 financial situation, because in both of those cases, you had other economic activity happening. I mean, now the world is essentially shut down. Certainly the US is right now. And to think about how the economy gets restarted and seeing the additional unemployment numbers today as we're talking come out, I mean, it's a scary time to think about what happens after this. Now, the good news, at least for venture capital investing, is you can go back and look at downturns and you can see that some amazing companies were built during those times.
Right.
They have to be lean, they have to be scrappy, they have to be capital efficient. And, a lot of times when you look back in vintage years, some of the capital vintage years are really the best when there are downturns. And so, that's a reason for optimism. Obviously, you and I are around eternal optimists all the time working with venture capitalists. And so it kind of rubs off on you. But that's certainly what keeps me smiling, is I can imagine the types of companies that will be built in the next few months and even few years.
Yeah. And I've had some of those conversations here in Michigan with some different founders that are even pivoting what they were doing and what they can do now, that, quite honestly, they could potentially be profitable. What are you seeing maybe in the sort of the national spotlight as far as founders switching gears as they react to this crisis?
Well, we're seeing a lot. I mean, if you have anything that can be helpful in the COVID-19 era here, I think you're going to get a strong look at investors. And if you can pivot to something that, is recognized either through distance communication, distance learning, or, obviously in the healthcare sector, if there are certain types of tests that can be repurposed or reimagined in a COVID-19 situation, you're going to, perhaps have a leg up than many others. And of course, the challenge for so many others is when you don't have consumers and when you don't have commercial activity and all of that stuff, things are we know, going to be difficult. And we know that, a lot of founders are having to really think about how do they increase their runway? What does their runway look like? What does revenue look like? Can they start what they had planned to start when a lot of sectors are just completely shut down right now? And how do they survive? And that's what's, I think, so challenging and difficult at this time.
Yeah. And we're in such a limbo stage of not knowing, even when we're going to come out of this, even partially, right? I mean, we don't even know when we're going to get back to business as normal. So, I mean, any type of an entrepreneur is really in sort of a state of flux at the moment of just kind of preparing what they can kind of see in front of them, as opposed to 6-8 months down the road. I mean, we're even hearing 12 to 18 months down the road is maybe when things will kind of get back to normal and to some sort of normalcy. Bobby, we talked a little earlier about sort of the strength of 2019 and it appears anyway in the last few years, not only in Michigan, but just the national landscape, that things have been on the rise, just in general. So now we have this crisis in front of us. What do you think as far as what are our results going to be like for the rest of this year? I mean, the assumption is that, we're going to see a downturn, of course. I mean, this is going to have some effect, but, as far as your point of view nationally, how do you think that this will sort of affect the numbers when we take a look at them in quarters, moving forward, or even when we look at this next year?
Well, clearly, I don't think you're going to see the record numbers we've had the last couple of years. But remember, a lot of those record numbers were a result of not the traditional venture capital dollars that
Mm-hmm.
raised by VCs, but they were from other sectors of investing coming in. People sometimes refer to them as tourist dollars or other things, but it's somebody that's not getting a return somewhere else that wants to come and try to get some alpha return in venture capital. The fact that you'll probably see less capital is one factor. The fact that some of the valuations will likely come down because of just business opportunity is another factor. On the other side of that coin, that, as I said, the vintage years of economic downturns have some amazing companies. So if folks are smart and they understand what they're doing, they'll see some opportunities. And so you don't see it go away completely, and it doesn't vanish overnight. The way venture works, of course, is you're raising essentially a 10-year fund. And so a lot of that money has already been raised and has been committed, and there's dry powder to make investments into great entrepreneurs to build companies. And a lot of VCs, when they make that investment, they also reserve additional capital for follow-on investments. And if the valuations come down, that money might be able to be stretched further. So, you will definitely see changes in numbers, I think, but it doesn't mean that, the entrepreneurial ecosystem somehow has to take a break. I don't see that at all. I see opportunities, and I see a great need, frankly. And coming out of this, when we're trying to get the economy going, I think your job and my job and colleagues of ours that work with policymakers are going to have to make sure that the lawmakers and others understand that if we're going to see an economic rebound, if we're going to see increased economic activity, then we're going to have to recognize that a lot of that is going to come from new, young, high-growth companies that entrepreneurs are starting, and with the help of their investors and partners and boards trying to grow in this, these next couple of years. And in many cases, that's going to be far more important than trying to, prop up something that may have a different look. Some established businesses, may not make it through this. So we need to think about the next generation of new companies.
Well, we also hope that the rebound won't be as a slow rebound as maybe some of the other crises that we've all been through. I mean, this pretty much was a complete stop because of one thing. Whereas if you take a look at the 08-09 recession, this was a gradual, we're getting bad, and we know it's going to get bad, and it's just going to get worse. So certainly, I think there's a hope with all of us that the rebound won't be, as severe. Although unemployment is going to be a big issue. As of even this morning, I think we saw some numbers in Michigan of 25% of the workforce is unemployed, and that's definitely going to have an impact, overall. But you made a good point too of just saying that it's the relevance of venture activity at a legislative level, continues to be important. So let's maybe, take a turn and kind of address the photo that's behind you, Capitol Hill, and really talk about some of the stimulus packages that are out there. I think for sure the question of the affiliation rule with the recent CARES Act has been something that NVCA has taken a lead on as far as trying to get some clarification behind that. Do you want to address that, maybe provide a little bit of a background on that first and sort of an update on where that all stands?
Sure. And obviously this is a virtual background. I'm sure you're hearing all sorts of noises. It turns out my neighbors just decided that today would be a good day to continue building whatever they're building in their backyard. So I've got dump
Well,
trucks.
at least you could do that there. We can't do that here. So the only thing I hear in the background here are garbage trucks driving by.
Well, I'm not sure they're supposed to be doing it, but in any event.
Yeah.
So on the CARES Act, so Washington tried to very quickly, and I think by some Washington standards, it was warp speed for them to get some money pushed out the door to try to help, in this case, the small businesses and others. And so when the bill was going through Congress, we started looking at it because like so many things in Washington, there's a healthy understanding of what large companies need or want. And when you think about Washington, we often call it a big company town. Every Fortune 500 company has a DC office. They have lobbyists, they have consultants, they have all sorts of resources at their disposal to work on what's important to them. And so Congress and policymakers many times react to the needs that are identified for large companies. So you see that sort of part of the economy well taken care of. And then on the other hand, you also have a large lobby and a large group of folks that pay attention to small mom and pop businesses. The folks on the corner that are only going to have one location and they don't intend to, grow into some high growth company. They're just going to kind of keep going. And everybody has needs here. What policymakers often don't understand is that high growth venture backed companies don't really fit into either category. And so our constant job is working with policymakers, making sure they understand the difference in what's good for a large company and what's good for a mom and pop many times doesn't fit. So here comes the CARES Act. Here comes a need to get dollars out the door. They turn to the Small Business Administration. They pick up a program that's been on the books for some time called the 7A loan program, and they try to jam $350 billion into it and say, here, go help small businesses. And so the first thing that we did was look at it and say, wait a minute, the 7A program requires a personal guarantee. That would make perfect sense for somebody that has, put their entire, heart and soul and resources into a corner store. They may be willing to sign a personal guarantee, but if you're trying to build some high growth company and the odds of failure are very high, as we know they are with venture-backed companies, then that doesn't really seem to make sense for you to somehow, put your family's the mortgage or anything else on the line for a risky endeavor. And so working with policymakers, we were able to get the personal guarantee knocked out as the bill was going through. Then we had to turn and realize, and remember, this is not an area we spend a lot of time on, and so we're having to learn on the fly. So then we look at it and say there's something called affiliation rules. And you can imagine that the Small Business Administration, as they were designing, or perhaps even had examples in the past of where somebody might be a 40% owner of several businesses, but they were really the ones that controlled those businesses. And you can imagine having to think about affiliation rules in that context. So somebody couldn't somehow scam the program and get tons of SBA loans and increase the concern from a government program's perspective. But that's so different than the way venture capital works. And so we had to go and explain to members of Congress that venture funds are designed and built, and the fund is raised to invest in a wide variety of companies. And just because there's one investor in many different types of companies doesn't mean that those companies are affiliated in any sort of way. And so you had to sort of, round peg, square hole type situation where we were trying to work with policymakers. And we were hopeful that they would clarify it before it became law. They didn't. And so we had to then, after the fact, try to get policymakers to reach out to the administration, to Treasury, to the SBA. I wrote several letters. I have a wonderful team of people that put together things, and somebody's name has to go on it, and that turns out to be mine. So I have to give credit to an incredible staff at NVCA. But we sent in letters to make sure that some of those questions and some of those concerns started to, kind of get answered. what do you do in this case? How are you going to, put out guidance? And then we had to really push SBA to give guidance. And like every day for a while, they would give new clarifications or give answers to frequently asked questions. Many of those questions we sent in. And so it's been sort of a slog to try to get the 7A or the Paycheck Protection Program, which is using the 7A authority, to try to get dollars out to companies. So I guess where we are in this stage is I think we've gotten most of the guidance that we will get with regard to the Paycheck Protection Program. The Senate has now passed more dollars to be put back into the program since it ran out really quickly. The House is trying to reconvene today to pass that. As soon as they do, the president will sign it and there'll be additional dollars that will be available, assuming all the criteria is met. I think if I could just one more moment, for a while there was the question of whether or not a venture-backed company would be eligible. And then it sort of has turned in our industry to one of, well, even if they're eligible, should they? And that sort of got exacerbated when we saw folks like Shake Shack and Potbelly and some larger companies take advantage. Or even though it wasn't the Paycheck Protection Program, the headlines about Harvard University taking $8 million or $9 million when they have a $40 billion investment. So now the question has turned to, just because you can, should you? And it's a really difficult question because, and I put the blame on Congress. They could have given clear guidance in the program on what their intentions were for it. And after the fact, in terms of the venture-backed companies and the affiliation rules, nearly 90 Republicans, Democrats, House members, senators wrote letters in support of venture-backed companies being eligible and making sure that the SBA and Treasury knew that they hope that just because a company might have venture backing shouldn't preclude them from being able to take advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program. So you have very little guidance out of Washington. The burden shifted from the banks when they gave lender deference onto the companies themselves for making certifications. And so entrepreneurs and companies and their boards of directors have been wrestling with this very question. And that's been, kind of the second part of this. Let me stop.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very insightful. I appreciate that. How do policy makers look at entrepreneurs and startups right now? What's your sense of that? I mean, you're kind of giving us a little bit of an insight of what you think they look at or how they're acting, but how are they viewing companies right now?
Well, I wish they had a more educated view, frankly, of entrepreneurs. They all want them, they all need them, but they don't really understand what an entrepreneurial ecosystem looks like or what they should be doing, frankly, to help them. And it goes back to what I was saying about how they understand big businesses, or at least what big businesses want. They understand, for most part, mom and pops and what's important to them, but they really don't understand high growth companies at all. And I think in a time like this, there's even less understanding. We spend so much time trying to help them think about. I'll give you examples in the tax space. So public policymakers have always thought that research and development spending has been good for the country, and who could disagree with that? But the way they think about it is that, we should have an R&D tax credit, and now we'll just have all this R&D spending. And a tax credit is only good for somebody that is actually in a tax-paying position. And as we know, startup companies aren't in a tax-paying position for a long period of time. Yet almost all of the spending that a young startup is doing is R&D type spending.
Right.
And they're the ones that need it the most, but they're the ones that really don't qualify for it. And so it's frustrating to us, and we have to go sit down with policymakers and help them understand. And in many cases, we have to point to other countries, like our friends in Canada. They have a refundable R&D tax credit. And other countries do as well. So, it's trying to educate them. And they sort of start from a premise, most members of Congress, from this conflation in their mind of Wall Street, hedge funds, private equity, buyouts, venture capital, investment banks. It's all the same to many of them. We're fortunate that we do have some members who really get it and really understand it, and we sort of refer to them internally as our champions, and we like to support them, and I know go to them probably more than they would like us to sometimes, but our job is to try to create more policymakers that have a great understanding of what is necessary. And so now, I talked about the CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program. And of course, there's the Main Street Lending Facility, and there's deferral of some tax provisions and things like that already in place. But as we look to what we believe will be necessary in the coming years or so, we're starting to talk to policymakers about other ways they can help startups. Like, for example, these net operating losses on the books. Why not, like other countries do, allow startups to monetize those losses? NOLs are an important commodity, so to speak, for most every business, and most every business can take advantage of their net operating losses. But startups, because of the unique nature and how many there are on the books, are many times disadvantaged, and they don't get to use them like we think they should.
Yeah. So it's constant education, whether you're in a crisis or not. And I think that's probably across the board, anywhere, whether you're here in Michigan or on a sort of a national landscape. We've got maybe a few minutes. We do have a question. We'll get to that in a minute. I do want to remind folks that we do have a chat component here that if you've got a question that you'd like Bobby to address, we'll definitely try to get to that in the remaining time. Talk a little bit more about NVCA for a little bit, Bobby, as far as some of maybe the additional resources. You referenced your website a little bit earlier, and I've gone to that, and you've got quite a bit there that really talks about, folks, what they need to go, what they can sort of take advantage of, during COVID-19. Do you want to maybe address what some of those bigger resources are that folks should take a look at on your site?
Sure. Thanks for that. So if you go to nvca.org and scroll down a little bit, there'll be a link. And if you sit there long enough, there'll be a pop-up to go to a COVID-19 resource page. And I think it's a great place where we've basically gathered everything, whatever Congress has passed, whatever guidance has come out. We've even created some guidance documents around the affiliation rule and the complications around it, trying to help folks understand what it means and what they need to do around that. So we're updating it on a daily basis with new information. So I think that's sort of the one-stop shop for folks to get tons of information and tons of resources around what's happening right now in Washington. And we'll continue to update that. So that's really the best place to go get information.
And we've given you guys a plug for that on our website as well, because I would agree. I think you've got a pretty comprehensive list going on there, and why recreate the wheel? And, these are times to be certainly supportive of one another. So we appreciate your team putting a lot of that together. Bobby, the question we've got that's come in is, I don't know if you can see this on your screen, is there any specific entrepreneurial sector you see garnering widespread demand once this is all over? I mean, you touched on a little bit of this. What type of business do you think will be the most in demand? Life science, real estate, information systems, et cetera. I think we could probably agree life science is probably at that top of the list, but are there other sectors that, we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, if I were
crystal ball,
if I were an expert in predicting the next sectors, I'm afraid I might not be doing this job. I might be actually one of our members. So
right.
I certainly don't hold myself out as an expert investor or anything. I do think it makes sense that anybody that has something, look, there are this unnatural shutdown of the U.S. is creating pain points, right? And it's creating problems and challenges. And that's what entrepreneurs wake up every day thinking about fixing, or thinking about, trying to provide relief, or understanding, challenges that we never thought we would need to think about. And that's what is so, fun to be a part of entrepreneurs and investors in entrepreneurs. I mean, they are going to figure out some solutions to these new problems, because I think most people are suggesting that it's not as if we're going to go back and everything's going to be exactly like it was. There are going to be things that may forever be changed. And when you have new realities and new situations, I think that's where entrepreneurs are at their best. Whether that's, bringing people together and distances, and, making Zoom better, or new. I saw an advertisement the other day for some company that claims to have, a better platform to do kind of video interaction. I have no idea if that's true or not, but I can imagine there'll be a lot of people trying. And so when you think about life sciences, when you think about, technology to make it easier for people to be socially distanced, but still sort of get things accomplished, those are the ones that rise to the top of my mind. But I by no means hold myself out as an expert investor or anything like that.
Well, I mean, I don't think any of us are. I think though, but those are really logical sectors. I mean, certainly they're the ones that are growing here in Michigan and have been for several years. So I would think that in answer to this question too, it's just really the IT realm, software development. I mean, that's going to go hand in hand with life science and healthcare. As far as the others, you're right. I think it's somewhat of a kind of a crystal ball. Well, as we wrap up, I mean, it's kind of about the time we've had. I want to thank you, Bobby, for joining us today, and still fighting the good fight in Washington. And any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to make before we end this webinar today?
Well, I just want to thank you for having me. It's great to, it's great for me to sort of think and focus on one state instead of all of them at one time, which we do kind of on a daily basis here at NVCA. It's great to, remind myself of all the great things that are going on in Michigan, and to, I guess in some way validate all that you have going on in Michigan. It's a wonderful opportunity. You've got so many resources that make the state, in so many parts of the state, really healthy entrepreneurial ecosystems. I use lots of different things I have seen and learned about Michigan when I'm talking to other states, and I point them to what's happening there. We started VC University, which is sort of an online curriculum, and our very first VC University live event was with the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. And
Right.
it was clear when we were there on campus, and seeing what's happening in the state and listening to some of the folks in the state, that there's a really special and unique blend of a lot of different components that are necessary to have great entrepreneurial activity.
Well, thank you for that. And hopefully when things lighten up, maybe we'll be able to do this in person one of these days. So Bobby, thank you for taking your time today to talk to us, and for all of you that have attended to watch us today. Again, I'm Ara Topouzian with Michigan Venture Capital Association, and more information about MVCA can be found at michiganvca.org. With that, we wish everyone a very safe and healthy journey as we get through this crisis. And that's it. Take care and tune in for another one of these webinars soon.